Houston, we have a podcast. You're listening to the Premier Rockets podcast. It's H-Town Hoops, hosted by Brandon Scott and Adam Spolane.
That's right. It is the H-Town Hoops podcast. Brandon Scott here with Adam Spolane, Austin Mendez producing this thing for us behind the scenes. And we're going to get right into it, man. We've got what I would classify, Adam, as an exciting pool, or at least an interesting candidate pool here for the Houston Rockets as they go into hiring a new head coach. As of course, as we covered in the last podcast, dismissed Stephen Silas, or decided not to renew Stephen Silas's contract. Now it is the interview process time to start requesting interviews and actually doing them. Frank Vogel, former Los Angeles Lakers head coach, obviously former Indiana Pacers head coach, won a championship with the Lakers. He is the one to have interviewed so far, and we have a list of names here of interview requests, and we've gone over some of these already in a previous episode. We've got Kenny Atkinson, Adrian Griffin, Kevin Young, James Borrego, and of course, Ime Udoka is the one who is not employed right now, who's also a potential candidate. But let's start, Adam, with Frank Vogel and your reaction there. I think we already kind of anticipated him being a candidate or somebody that they would be interested in. Obviously, somebody that they would be interested in. But what are you hearing, and what are your thoughts on them interviewing Frank Vogel for this vacancy?
Yeah, that was one of the names that we were hearing about, back during the winter. That was going to be one of the first calls that they made. I've always thought personally that Tillman Fertitta wants to sit up at the podium during a press conference and be able to say, we have a championship head coach, and that's what Frank Vogel is. Frank Vogel is one of the few active head coaches to have won championships, and basically one of the few, at least right now, that are available. So he certainly makes sense. He's won a lot. He's had kind of a strange career where he took over this Indiana team from Jim O'Brien, and they were young and didn't seem to have much of a direction. And then they really grew with each other. They grew with Paul George as the best player. They built really good defenses with Roy Hibbert anchoring things in with George, obviously. And you had George Hill and the power forward whose name that I can't remember. So that's that is.
Were you talking about David West?
Yes, thank you, David West. I'm sorry.
Yeah. And I was muted when I was trying to step in there, so my bad.
And, Lance Stevenson was on those teams. So they were basically, for a 3-year stretch, the second best team in the East. They just couldn't get past LeBron. And, there's no shame in, having trouble getting past LeBron. Paul George gets hurt. That whole thing falls apart. Then he goes to Orlando, and it was just a strange fit in Orlando. They seem to have no direction whatsoever. He gets there, and they make that really weird Serge Ibaka trade where they give up Victor Oladipo and a first-round pick. And then they had signed they had a couple other bigs on the roster. It was a roster that made no sense. He had no chance. They got rid of him after a couple of years. Then he went to the Lakers, and the first year was really good. And they obviously, even before the bubble, they were probably the best team in the league when COVID came around. And then they were obviously great in the bubble, and they won a championship and really dominated for much of that postseason. And then, the Lakers thing kind of fell apart, some poor roster decisions and what have you. So I do think that Frank Vogel is a really strong candidate. He's a head coach who has very much been underappreciated over the course of his career. Some of the offensive stuff, if you do hire him, I think you want to bring in an offensive guy to at least help with that part of the game. But the defensive stuff, I don't think there's ever been any question about that.
Yeah, and the defensive stuff, obviously, I mean, this is not. It's a bad team, okay? It's bad offensively, it's bad defensively, but the defensive stuff is what stands out in particular, and we talked about that a lot too. And so that is, to me, what makes it really intriguing. Obviously, the things that you mentioned about him being a championship coach, I think there's something to that. Not just being able to say it, but having that experience of being a championship coach, and having worked with. I obviously did not go well with Orlando, as you mentioned, but he does have that experience. Like, you would like to think that there's something that he could take from that and apply it, and has applied it to his further experience. Right? That's kind of how life works anyway. So I actually like that aspect. the thing that's kind of kind of sticky about it, if you're a Rockets fan, is like being worried about things being good for him at every other stop. Where with the Pacers, there's the clear franchise player, and I guess Paul George emerged into that while he was there. But you got Paul George with the Pacers, but then he goes to Orlando, where it's like you said, a weird team, and then the Lakers. There's an obvious appeal there with, or an opportunity there with AD and LeBron James, and so that's successful. And then the next trip is to the Rockets, and so it's like, okay, is this the every other, is this his, is this more analogous to his Orlando situation than it is to say the Pacers and the Rockets, or the Pacers and the Lakers situation, which is what I would be sort of concerned about. And maybe that's more for him to be concerned about than for the Rockets to be concerned about, because he would obviously be an upgrade. But it is something that I kind of just thought about, just in terms of his journey and sort of the irony of that. That's kind of interesting about it. But there's no question about it. Like, going back to my earlier point about, I think that beyond the vanity point of being able to just say you've got a championship head coach, there is some value in bringing in, and we'll talk about some of these other candidates. But the thing that stands out about him and maybe a couple of others is that he has been a head coach and been a successful head coach, and that you have the track record. One of the most, I think coaching is one of the harder things to predict. Like, can a guy coach? Will a guy be a good coach before you've seen him do it? And so there's just a value to me in a guy that you have seen do it, and obviously with Vogel in multiple stops.
And he's a defensive guy, and I think Rafael Stone would probably tell you that he likes that defense is probably most important on his list as well. So I think that those two kind of mesh in that way. It's it's a different roster than obviously it's a much younger roster than he probably has ever had to deal with, and on that aspect of it, just Orlando. They paid Bismack Biyombo a ton of money and then traded their best guard in order to get another big in Serge Ibaka. There was clearly, and they already had Aaron Gordon at the time. There was clearly no direction there. And you would hope with the Rockets, they're not going to trade any sort of young asset to, get some other veteran who's right on the brink of free. That whole thing was just a mess. He might not be the most exciting name. He might be a little underwhelming to some people, but I mean, all you have to do is look at what he did to the Rockets and what those Lakers teams did to the Rockets during that 2020 postseason, and it should tell you that he's going to be able to put together a really good defense. And I think that, like you said, that's what this team really could use, just some sort of direction, some sort of organization in that part of their game.
Yeah, Adam, just off the top of my head, the only openings that I've really thought about are the Rockets and the Pistons.
Yeah,
But
that's really it.
yeah, and so I guess, and I guess that answers my question, because I was going to say, more than I look at it almost the other way. If you're going to be like, it's not a sexy name, or like the one that you prefer. Like, if jobs open up, or like if there's a market, like, I feel like his name goes up to the top right there with another name that we'll mention here in Ime Udoka, which is a kind of a different situation. But in terms of caliber coach, I mean, he probably should be at the top, actually. If you're just kind of listening based off of resume and results and what you've seen. So if anything, like, once we get a greater sense for what the landscape looks like, I would be more concerned with there being like a competition for Frank Vogel, right? Like almost competing for him. I don't know how demand he is in right now, but I would assume that he should be more than one team should want him.
You would think, but like you said, there's only one other team that has an
Yeah.
opening right now, and I haven't seen Frank Vogel on the Pistons list at this
Me
point.
neither.
And
Yeah, me neither.
and there may wind up. I mean, I'm sure there will wind up being other openings at some point, at least of the 20 teams that made the play-in or the playoffs. So we'll have to wait and see. But I think one of the aspects of Vogel that maybe turns teams off is that he's been fired by 10% of the league, and so I think sometimes that can be hard to sell. Is that, okay, here's this guy, but you know what? He was fired by this team. He was fired by that team. Then he was fired just a couple of years ago. So why are we hiring this guy again? And that was kind of the thing with Mike D'Antoni. Mike D'Antoni, I think, had been fired by more than he'd been fired by like 5 teams by the time that the Rockets hired him. So it's, it's one of those, there's the PR aspect of it where, let's be honest, if somebody tweets out Frank Vogel has been hired as the head coach of the Houston Rockets, that's not going to get overwhelming praise by the fan base. I think that we can both agree on whether or not they're wrong.
Yeah.
That's a whole other conversation. But I just don't know. He's not the type of exciting name that's going to get a fan base fired up. But that was the case with D'Antoni. Nobody wanted D'Antoni. I remember when D'Antoni was hired, just how that was ripped everywhere. Except for me, I was one of the few people who defended it, and I really liked the hire at the time, and I turned out to be very right about that. Just
Yeah.
just want to bring that up.
Well, no, that was the point. I was going to actually make that point. I'm glad you made it, because I was going to say, by the way, that did work out. Like that team immediately looked different, was better. James Harden became a different player, became an MVP level player. And I mean, he was already like really, really good, but like I feel like this really changed things, made him a point guard, and did all kind of really cool things. And that team was exciting and great, fun to watch and competitive. So like that, for as widely panned as it may have been at the time, that actually worked out really well. So yeah, I mean, if anything, I'll make this point before we move on about fans and how they respond to these different names and these candidates. They should feel good about this. Like, you should feel really good. I mean, there are names that you should feel maybe not even as good about as a Frank Vogel. Like, to even be in a conversation to be able to get a coach like that, or some of these other names that we're going to mention, Rockets fans should feel like they're in a really good position right now. So this is, I mean, of course you're going to nitpick. That's what we're here for, and pick things apart. But feel good, generally speaking, overall about sort of like how I opened the show, sort of the candidate pool right here. So let's move on here, because we mentioned, and I'll list these again, outside of Frank Vogel, who's already interviewed apparently. You've got Sam Cassell, Sixers assistant coach, obviously of Rockets fame from the 90s. They've requested to interview Kenny Atkinson, who is an assistant coach for the Golden State Warriors. Adrian Griffin, who's been a lead assistant for a number of teams. Adrian Griffin's been a lead assistant for at least 3 teams, and obviously played in the league. Kevin Young, who is with the Phoenix Suns, and James Borrego, who was most recently the head coach of the Hornets, but also has a background with the Spurs, was a longtime assistant with the Spurs, if I remember correctly. So was that? What was that? Oh yeah, and Coach Orlando. That's right, because he took over.
For
How did that work?
He took over for Jacques Vaughn, and I believe Frank Vogel took over for him. I might have that. I might have that off by a year. I think there might have been Scott Skiles might have been in there for a year in between, but there wasn't much overlap between the Vaughn Borrego duo to Vogel. But I think there was one. I think there was a Scott Skiles year in between that group.
Yeah, because I feel like I thought Borrego worked for Scott Skiles, but either way, I could be now I'm confused. But either way, that's it. That's who he is, and of course, we mentioned earlier, Ime Udoka is a clear and obvious candidate who we expect them to talk to or interview at some point. Should be hearing about that. Let's start with Sam Cassell here for obvious reasons. We talked about him a little bit in the last one because you mentioned him as kind of I don't know if sleeper is the right word, but just as a name to look out for, someone to think about when we're starting to talk about Rockets head coaching candidates. And now they've been given permission by the Sixers to interview Sam Cassell. What do you think about this? I am a fan of this. I don't think that Sam Cassell is necessarily the best candidate that they have on this list, but I do think for me personally, he's the most, and he is the one that I am most intrigued by for a number of reasons. What do you think about him as a candidate?
Well, he's certainly not the most qualified. Like, let's get that out of the way.
Right. Yes.
Because, we're going to be talking about a bunch of guys who have already been head coaches before and already had a lot of success as head coaches before in the league. But he is intriguing because he's a guy who has really paid his dues as an assistant. He did it in Washington, and then he's been with Doc Rivers now for almost a decade, both in LA and now in Philly. And he's interviewed for multiple head coach jobs, in the past, including the Rockets back in 2020 after Mike D'Antoni left. So he's been on the radar for a lot of teams now for a while. He just hasn't been able to get that one job. But obviously, he links the Rockets love talking about the past. They love talking about 94. They love talking about 95. There's a room in Toyota Center called the 94-95 room. It's a big deal. They obviously, those are the 2 championships. They love reminiscing.
That's all they got. That's all they got, Adam. That's all they got.
So that they love reminiscing on that past. He kind of links that past with the future. I do think that's something that they would value. So I certainly think that he should be in the mix. Again, he's earned that opportunity. He's paid his dues as an assistant coach, and that's what you want to see. And he also has a little bit of a connection now with James Harden, having coached him now for the last season and a half. I don't know if Harden is his pregame workout guy. I'm not sure. I have not seen Sixers workouts, pregame workouts this season, so I don't know if that's the case. But again, they've worked together for a while, so I imagine they do have some sort of a relationship, which could matter when we get to the summer.
Yeah, so Sam Cassell, there's obviously some nostalgia and connection to the area and to the franchise that we've already gone over. So there is that. But beyond that, just as a coach, you mentioned him paying his dues. Like specifically, I like the way, like aside from just paying the dues, I like the way that he's mentored young players. And, there's a respect level that comes with him being Sam Cassell. But specifically as a coach, John Wall, you want to talk about degrees of separation and connections. John Wall is somebody who has credited Sam Cassell for his early development, for being there early on in his time in Washington. There have been a number of players who talk about, using Sam Cassell as some sort of counsels and using him as somebody that that they trust and that they'll talk to, and whose opinion that they really believe in. How his credibility in basketball circles translates to being a head coach, I'm not exactly sure, but I'm interested to see it. I would be interested to see it. I think it's intriguing. And beyond that, I would say the thing that I like most about Sam Cassell is his temperament, or the fact that I feel pretty comfortable saying that Sam Cassell has an edge to him. Just from being around him as a little child at the Fondy Rec Center, all the way up to very recently, the video, like at the very least, Adam, we can say this, and this, we'll talk about this, what this team needs exactly in terms of culture shifts and things like that. That's something we'll get into. But one thing that I think that the head coach could use, or that they wouldn't mind having, and you talk about going in a different direction from the guy that you just let go, or the guy that you just had in that position, is somebody with a little bit of an edge to him. And Sam Cassell's got that, because I've seen him on video. We've seen this. Sam Cassell MFing James Harden in a drill. Like, and they didn't get into, like, it wasn't confrontational. It was just like, it was, somewhat confrontational, but it was basically like, nah, like correcting him, like, MFer, no, like this, see, like basically standing up to the star player. And let's just be honest, and I'm stating the obvious here. There is not a player until and if they sign James Harden back on this team, there is not a player who is as accomplished as that on this team. I feel like he comes in with instant credibility, but also comes in with a little bit of an edge to him, and can somewhat relate to the players, connect to the players, but also really hold them accountable and grab their attention in ways that maybe they haven't in the past, or the way that the coaches haven't in the past. So I'd be interested to see that, just from a personality standpoint, like how that would mesh and how his mentorship would go with Houston's young players like Jalen Green and Kevin Porter Jr. and of course Jabari Smith, who is somebody who I think would take well, specifically Jabari Smith, who would take well to Sam Cassell's coaching. But I find that intriguing. I find him intriguing as a guy who, like you mentioned, and I think appropriately mentioned, is not even the first, second, or even probably third most qualified guy among this list of candidates.
Yeah, and I do think they want somebody who is going to be, I guess, a little more heavy-handed.
Yeah.
And I do think that that's one of the areas with Silas that it's just not who he is. Silas just isn't going to be that heavy-handed type of guy. He said the one of the times, at least we know about, where he really got on guys was during that shoot around against Minnesota. And he said, once word got out about that shoot around, he basically said, I come from the school of Don Nelson, and Don Nelson said, you get 6 bullets a year. I can really go at guys really 6 times, because after that it kind of starts to fall on deaf ears a little bit. I don't know if that's the case. I don't know. I'm not sure how NBA players think, but at the same time, I do think that you need to, be willing to do it more than the 6 times. You know what I mean? Just have a little bit more fire just with that sort of stuff, especially with a young group. I think it's different with a veteran group. A veteran group, they can kind of police themselves. I think that's what made Mike D'Antoni really effective with those Rockets teams in 2018, 2019, 2017, 2018, 2019, because they had a bunch of vets who just knew how to police themselves and they held each other accountable. I think that's what you want out of a veteran team. They don't necessarily need the coach to do it, but with a younger team, you do kind of need the coach to do it because you don't have anybody else who really has the sway within the locker room, or I guess I don't know the best word to say it, but they don't have that.
Yeah, the equity, the
Yeah,
equity or the
yeah,
credibility and all of that. Yeah,
you just can't do it you can't do it when you're 22. You
yeah.
just can't. So yeah. So that's why I do think that you need that a little bit more as a head coach. And Sam Cassell is a guy who had success as a player. He won 3 championships as a player, and he was a very, very important part of 2 of those. So I think that matters as well.
What do you think of Ime Udoka as a candidate for the Rockets, as a head coaching candidate? I don't know exactly. Like he's been really good. He's a really good assistant. Was really good in his year with the Celtics. Obviously, a very odd way for his tenure to end there. I don't even know if you can call it a year, tenure. But his time there, I don't know what the right word is there, but like it's just an odd. Like to me, if I'm talking Ime Udoka, the only drawback of Ime Udoka is the awkwardness of it. Like just not really knowing, hey, what's going on here? What happened here? What are you doing? Or should I even ask? I don't know. Like it's just weird. And just just the fact that he came from a highly successful team that went to the finals and then all of a sudden he wasn't the coach anymore. Like what to do with that is strange. But then once you get past that part of it, if you can, and just get to the basketball part, it's like, yo, if they could get Ime Udoka, that is like, pretty close to optimal. What do you think about him as a candidate for them?
Well, he doesn't have a job for a reason. I mean, I think that's the key part, is that there is a reason he doesn't have a job right now.
Yeah,
So I have to know exactly what happened in Boston. I
yeah,
have to know every single detail of that story before I even go there. And
yeah.
he's got to be upfront about it. He's going to have to be upfront about it in public if you do hire him, but I need to know all the details there. And again, I don't know what happened, but you hear players. I remember there was the stuff after it happened, and I think it was Matt Barnes who was saying how this was such an injustice, and the Celtics are doing him dirty. And then he went on like an Instagram live or something a few
And
days
walked it
later.
back.
Yep,
Yeah,
nope. You know what? I was wrong. The Celtics were totally in the right for what
yeah.
they. Now time has passed since that actually happened, but again, I need to know what went down.
But you
So
know what? I'm glad you pointed that out because I remember that. And that's a key moment, a key like moment in time, it feels like, where this happens with Matt Barnes. And it's not like we know Matt Barnes has a podcast and does media and everything, but it's not just some gas bag out there giving a
it's not
take. And
us.
right. It's not us giving a take and then rethinking it and walking it back, a little bit later. It's somebody who is informed and connected in the league, in Matt Barnes, who thought one thing that let's be honest, seemed kind of atypical for a jock or somebody in that role to say, like, if we're honest, like kind of like, oh, of course he would say something like that. It's like, oh, you kind of eye roll. And then somebody clearly checked him on it and was like, nah, man, let me tell you, man. And we don't know, to be clear, we don't know what they told him, but we just know that they must have told him something because he come back singing a different song. So yeah, I don't know what to do with that at all. It feels like everybody got uncomfortable with it. Like once it all kind of came out, like with I guess more so with the way it was presented or the way that it came out, and that sort of got in the way of getting down to the truth of the matter, or figuring out, like at the very least, like publicly, we should understand how egregious of a thing we're talking about here, or what exactly are we talking about here, you know. And I don't even want to like
I mean, we've all heard rumors. Like,
yeah, I don't even want to like put
I'm not
out
even
the
going
yeah, you know what I mean? You feel what I'm saying? Like I'm kind of like towing this line. Like I don't even want to like put out there what we've heard, but like whatever it is, we need a little bit more, a little bit. We need a lot more clarity on it than what we have to kind of feel good and comfortable with even going there. Like I said, from a basketball standpoint, it's like an obvious play.
He's number one just on a
Yeah.
basketball.
Yeah.
on a
It's
basketball.
it's such an obvious play on a basketball standpoint. Like you said, number one, arguably. And then but it's just the other stuff, and you're like, okay, uh, you want to feel good about a new hire. You don't want to go into it with those kind of uh uncomfortable feelings, or feeling like you're misleading the public, or like like you haven't fully vetted the thing, or whatever it is. So they, like you said, I just reiterate what you said. You definitely need to fully vet that, and it's worth doing, considering what I feel like it could mean. Like I been fascinated with the idea of Ime Udoka in any environment, in any setup, young players, veterans. That guy's just a good coach. Now what kind of guy he is, I have no idea. I have no clue. And what all of this is about, the reason why he could lead a team to the finals. Now, granted, a team that was already good when he got there, but a lead a team to the finals and not be working there the next year, and have like vague explanations for why. Yeah, we need to know more about that. Definitely need to know more about that. But it's a fascinating kind of hypothetical. Okay, let's just real quick before we move on. Just no, go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
One more thing on Udoka.
Yeah, of
If
course.
they do, the thing is, if you hire him, then he's, like I said, he has got to explain everything that went down. Like, he just has to, because those questions are going to be there. That's what the press conference will be when he is introduced. If he is introduced as the next head coach of the Rockets, that is what the press conference is going to be about. It's going to be about what happened in Boston. And if you give me a bunch of non-answers, or if you dance around it, or if you say that's in the past, I'm here to talk about the future, that's not going to work. So and it's going to continue to follow him around all of training camp, all of the season. So if you do hire him, you've got to be forthcoming about everything, because you can't just go from I'm coaching in the NBA finals to a few months later, I've now been suspended indefinitely. And then very quietly, the Celtics just, cut all ties with him. I mean, that's a story. So why he is available is a huge, huge story. And it's one thing to vet him, but then you also have to be forthcoming about what happened and why you were available in the first place, or it's going to follow you around for a long time. It's going to continue to follow you around and the organization around.
Yeah, and I'm trying to figure out the right way to say this without being irresponsible. What I'm trying to say here is, like, if there is a question of Ime Udoka's character or discipline, which I think is what the heart of what's going on is, like, has a lot to do with character, discipline, outside of the basketball realm. Okay, in like personal and life and encounters and endeavors. If there is an issue and question about that with him that's serious enough for him to be out of a job after success where he came from, if there is a serious enough question about that, there also has to be a serious enough question if that's the type of person that you are trying to bring around young players that you're trying to mold and develop. You say what you want about Steven Silas, but my goodness, I've got a 7-year-old son, and I can just hope to God that he is like a man, something like Steven Silas. To hell with basketball. You know what I mean? Like the type of people that you're trying to bring around your organization, and specifically, I'm not trying to make it seem like he's coming and be their dad, but like that type of figure, that type of, and I don't know, like, again, not father figure, but a mentor, leadership type of figure for young guys who were born in the early 2000s. Okay, like you want that guy to be somebody that you feel good about being an influence, a heavy influence on your young players. So that's what I say about it.
And this is America. Everyone gets second chances in America, but again, you got to be forthcoming about why you need the second chance in the first place. So be honest, be forthright, be apologetic, all that stuff. But if you try and dance around it, that's not going to work. It's not going to work.
Let's just run through real quick, rapid fire, through these other candidates. And we mentioned some of them before, but we got Kenny Atkinson, Adrian Griffin, Kevin Young, James Borrego. Who stands out to you? Just kind of give me your rapid fire thoughts on any and all of them.
Adrian Griffin reminds me a lot of Sam Cassell. Doesn't have the playing resume.
Yes, that's a good point.
Have the ties within the organization, but he's been an assistant coach now for a while.
A decade.
I was actually looking. James Borrego, who I'll talk about in a second, he was the interim coach in Orlando when they fired Jacques Vaughn. And then Scott Skiles took over the next year, and Adrian Griffin was one of his assistants. And then Skiles was gone after a year, and then they hired Frank Vogel at that point. So Griffin's been around, he coached under, like I say, he coached under Scott Skiles. He's coached under Billy Donovan. He's coached under Nick Nurse, who is another guy who I'm sure we'll get to at some point during this process. So the resume is really strong. I think it's only a matter of time that he becomes a head coach in the NBA. Atkinson, we've talked about him. We talked about him, the last time. Really strong resume, having dealt with teams that are young, but the teams that he had success with in Brooklyn were not teams that you say, oh, this team is super talented. Those weren't his teams. They were kind of underappreciated, and he made them into something. And he built them into something, and he really we'll talk about culture, but he really kind of built that culture into what it was in Brooklyn. And then the Stars got there, and they kind of ruined the whole thing. Young. From Phoenix is an interesting name because in a sense, he's kind of like what Silas would have been like a decade ago, a young, really strong X's and O's guy. Devin Booker has spoken really highly of him in Phoenix. I'm not sure if he's the top assistant in Phoenix right now, but he has kind of climbed up the ladder there since Monty Williams took over. He's been with Monty Williams essentially that entire stretch. So I think it's only a matter of time before he gets a head coaching job, but I don't know if it might be a little early for that at this stage, especially when, the other guys that we're talking about have been head coaches in the league. And then Borrego is a really interesting case because, he had the Orlando interim thing aside, that kind of throw that away, but spent a lot of time with the Spurs under Greg Popovich, and he was kind of a stealth finalist for the job in 2016 when they hired D'Antoni. And people think really highly of him, and he had a pretty decent run in Charlotte, and just for whatever reason, those seasons ended so poorly. And I don't know if he clashed with LaMelo Ball or what exactly the problem was, but they got to the play-in, a couple times, and then they just got blown out of the play-in games. So he had kind of a weird exit, and it was a big surprise when they fired him in Charlotte last year. But Charlotte's kind of a dysfunctionally run organization at this point. So maybe you get him into a different environment and that works better. But he's an interesting name, and I think that he's one of those guys. Remember Terry Stotts? Stotts kind of got fired a couple different times. He got a couple of bad jobs. He was in Milwaukee. He's in Atlanta. Really no chance of winning back in the early 2000s. And then he got to Portland, and it was a completely different situation. And they had a good infrastructure, and they had a great player in Damian Lillard, and they had a ton of success during his stretch. They never won a championship, but it wasn't because of coaching. So that to me is almost what you could have with James Borrego, someone where you get him into a better situation, a better opportunity, he could really run with it. So I do think that makes him kind of an interesting name during this process.
Yeah, with Borrego, I asked this somewhat tongue in cheek, but kind of seriously. I wonder what folks that are part of the Orlando Magic, like, and then more specifically the Hornets organization, can you really blame someone for failing with the Hornets? Like
he didn't really fail though.
Yeah, well, exactly. Well, and when I say fail, Adam, all I'm talking about is getting fired. Like I'm not even talking about his record. Like, yeah, I would agree with you. Like, I mean, it was talking about making lemonade taking lemons and making lemonade. Figure you did the best you could with it being Charlotte, but like you get fired from Charlotte, and you're like, well, what was he supposed to do there? With the way that organization is run. So, yeah, I think that's that James Borrego is an interesting one. The only thing. And the reason why I feel like that question about it is, can you hold that against a guy getting fired from Charlotte? It's like, okay, well, he was in Charlotte, like if Charlotte didn't want him, why is he good enough? I mean, like, is it worth it? Like it's kind of like almost like a lazy throwaway. But I think when you look at his background and the actual kind of just peel the layer back a little bit, you'll see that there's actually something to him there, specifically with the Spurs background. And even getting that job, like the the interim. Like I'm trying to remember exactly how that season went, where he takes over. But you get those jobs, like they make you the interim and show that extra vote of confidence in you. I feel like it was early on when he took over that year too, and they give you that extra vote of confidence. I feel like for a reason, like you mentioned, he's a highly thought of guy, super respected guy. So that I find to be really interesting. Obviously, Kenny Atkinson is somebody who's been around forever, has a background. Another guy on this list we're talking about, along with Frank Vogel and Ime Udoka, who's already been a successful head coach. You've seen it already. So he would be, to me, toward the top of the list for that reason. For that reason alone, having had success as a head coach already, we've seen it. And then Adrian Griffin, I mentioned earlier about him being a lead assist. The guy is like, you mentioned earlier, very, very much analogous to Sam Cassell in the sense of former player who's been an assistant for a decade. But been a lead assistant at a number of places now. And you laid it out a moment ago with the Orlando background, but did it under Billy Donovan with the Thunder. It's been under Nick Nurse, and we can get into Nick Nurse as well here in a moment. But Adrian Griffin reminds me of Cassell in the sense of somebody that has put in the work, put in the time, been respected enough to be a lead assistant in multiple places. And so makes a lot of sense for this to be like the next logical step for him, to kind of be like next up in a position like this.
And I kind of like the coaches, who have been career assistants, but they have coached under a lot of different head coaches. That was one of the things that you kind of like about Silas, that Silas worked, he coached under his dad, but he also coached under Don Nelson. He coached under Rick Carlisle. I think that stuff, and he coached under Steve Clifford as well. I mean, that stuff matters. You look at Adrian Griffin. He coached under Scott Skiles in Milwaukee and in Orlando. He coached under Tibbs in Chicago. He's coached under Billy Donovan. He's coached under Nick Nurse. I mean, those are a bunch of really good head coaches that are on that list. And for him to have learned under them, I think that matters. So, I think I don't know if it's kind of a strike against Cassell, but the fact that Cassell has spent really not his entire career, because he did have those years in Washington, but such a majority of his career has been under just Doc Rivers. So the fact that you have a guy in Griffin who has coached under a lot of different coaches and seen a lot of different styles and seen so he has kind of an idea of what he thinks works and what he thinks doesn't work. I think that's important also.
Do you think that they could even just on because we did mention Kevin Young, I kind of want to go back here real quick. Do you think they could go that route again? Like after dismissing a Steven Silas and you're transitioning, you say you need a new voice. It would obviously be a new voice because it'd be a different person. But it seems like it would be a similar profile in terms of Young and Silas. I should be maybe that's not fair because he's been an assistant for so long. And he looks a lot younger than he actually is. But maybe the better way to frame this question is, after going with a first-time head coach, can you then go with such a young coach or such a inexperienced coach to back that up? Like, does it feel like it's got to be one of these more experienced guys, or could they go outside of the box and get like an up-and-comer?
You would think that they would go for someone with more experience, but you sit down with one of these guys and you talk to them and say, "Hey, this is our guy." Maybe they just blow you away with just the vision that they have. And I think that's what matters when you get into the room more than anything else. And Rafael Stone said this on Monday, is that you want somebody who shares your vision in the future of the organization. So if any of these assistants who don't have any head coaching experience come and they say they're in the room and they kind of run down what their vision is for the future, and it feels like they have a great plan, and the guys who have head coaching experience don't, then you got to go with the guy whose vision is aligned with yours, because I think that's how you have a good working relationship. And I think that's how you grow as an organization. So it all depends on what happens in the room. I mean, if one guy blows you away, then maybe that's the guy that you have to go with. I don't think that you can kind of lock yourself in this box of, well, we want to get, we hired a first-time head coach the first time. We can't do that now. Now we have to go with somebody who doesn't have any experience. I mean, you got to go with who you think is going to be the best guy. I don't think you can say, oh, we did box A the last time, so we got to go to box B this time.
Yeah. And I feel like that's more of a tendency, but I agree with you wholeheartedly. Yeah, you got to go with whoever you're convictions say is the best guy for the position. Let me ask you this about Nick Nurse.
Mhm.
What's going on with Nick Nurse, man?
I wish I could tell you.
What the hell is that about? Like I don't get it. The guy, I mean, I guess the recency bias would say, play in tournament. I don't know. Like to me, Nick Nurse should have some sort of built up. I mentioned the word equity earlier. I feels like he should have some built up equity with the Raptors organization, and that he should have some kind of connection there of wanting to be there. And maybe it is a matter of money. I don't know. I don't. What the hell is going on there? Like if there's anything they should be wanting to keep, it feels like it should be Nick Nurse. That to me would also be odd for different reasons, obviously, but that would also be odd if he were to be available to me.
Sometimes you just need a change of scenery.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
think that both sides could probably say, you know what, I think we might be better off, both sides just moving in a different direction. I don't know the inner workings of Toronto. I don't know that relationship between Nick Nurse and Masai Ujiri. Maybe they aren't quite as aligned now as they were in the past. I mean, that organization feels like it's in a little bit of flux where you have these young guys on one hand, and then you've got kind of the holdovers from the championship team with Van Vliet and with Anunoby.
Siakam, yeah.
Yes, Siakam also. So they're in they're in a little bit of a purgatory right now. So I don't know. It is odd to say the least. The way that season went down, there were some really high expectations for them. Last year they won 40 plus games. They were the 6th seed in the East. They took a couple games off Philly in the first round, and you felt that that organization is only going up because all those guys were young. They were bringing back the entire roster, and then they never fired off this year for whatever reason. So I would love to know the inner workings of what went down there. But I don't think there's any doubt that Nick Nurse would be a quality, head coach that you want to look at. It's just, for the from a Rocket standpoint, if he's making $8 to $10 million in Toronto, he's going to want more than that. You're going to have to make a huge financial commitment in order to hire a guy like Nick Nurse, and we'll have to wait and see if the Rockets would be willing to do that.
Yeah, man. It's just an odd thing. I guess I hadn't thought about that too, though. How you mentioned that they got the weird combination of players, though, as well, of the holdovers and the new guys. The old guard and the new guard. It's an interesting thing. But Nick Nurse being available is again, to have. Let's just put it like this: to be in a hiring cycle where you could potentially have two guys, two former head coaches, and I guess in Nurse's case, still a head coach, but two coaches who have won a championship be available to you, and another one who went to one in his first year as a head coach, and another guy who has had success as a head coach, and Kenny Atkinson, who would be, I guess, throw him fourth in there. That's wild to me. That like that's the opportunity in front of you. And that's not to say that all of those guys necessarily would for sure say yes to the Rockets. I'm sure if you threw them enough money, they probably would. But just the idea that you could be in that situation, to me, like I opened this thing up with, got to be exciting for Rockets fans. I'll just ask you this question before we move on.
Well, and
Oh,
one
go
more
ahead.
thing,
Yeah,
because
for sure.
normally when you get into these cycles, you might have 5, 6, 7, maybe even 8 jobs available.
Yeah.
But right now, you got one other job. It's the Rockets and Pistons right now. And it seems like the Pistons are going with a completely different list of candidates to fill their job. So a lot of times you'll have a bunch of jobs open and you'll have the same teams competing for the same names. It seems like right now you have 2 jobs that are open and those teams are competing for completely different names at this point. So you essentially almost have your pick of whoever you want. At least that's what it feels like right now.
Yeah, it seems like the only crossover I saw, and I'm throwing this out there because I didn't just saw it in a headline. But the only crossover I saw was Udoka for the Pistons.
Mm-hmm.
So other than that, I don't know of any other crossover. And Udoka, obviously, like we say, there's some complications there that speak to his candidacy and how good you might feel about that. But if all's clear and it's just about basketball, if you could answer for the other things, that honestly are more important and can be more important, then that would be an interesting sort of bidding war possibility there. And which again, my last question on this for you, out of the candidates that we've gone over, if you were to say of a best fit, who you think is the best fit for the Rockets in their position now? Is that even something that we could ascertain at this point? Or is it more about just kind of the opportunity? And by that I mean, is it fair to compare some of these other situations, some of their other experiences to the ones that they're gonna have now? Like, should we just wipe the slate clean for some of these guys, and then especially the ones who haven't, obviously who haven't done it, who haven't seen do it? Like, how would you sort of view this from a fit standpoint based off of the candidates that we got?
In all honesty, the best fit is probably somebody who we didn't talk about today, and that's Scott Brooks, because Scott Brooks is a head coach that has basically coached the exact situation that the Rockets are in right now, and he's had success with it. So to me, if you're just looking for overall who would be like, because I know what Scott Brooks can do with a really, really young team, because I've seen it happen. It happened, it happened a little more than a decade ago. So that's why I would say him. Again, it kind of falls into the same box as Vogel, where he's not going to be the most exciting name out there, but I do know what he can do in this type of a situation. I don't think the Rockets have requested to interview him yet, which is somewhat surprising because he was one of the names that we talked about on Sunday. But that to me might be the guy who would be the best fit of the guys that we talked about. I don't know. I hesitate to say Vogel, but I do think that he would certainly help them. I don't know how he would do with a team this young, because while he had a youngish team in Indiana, you still had David West, who was older. You had I don't know if you necessarily call Roy Hibbert older, but he was a guy who had at least been to college for a while. So
Yeah,
he
Danny Granger and George
yeah,
Hill were on that team.
yeah, George Hill's a really good name that he had there too. So it's not like he had a bunch of 22-year-olds there, but they were a team that when he got there, they had not won, and then that group really grew together with Paul George, developing and adding George Hill to that mix. So I don't think you can go wrong with Vogel. I don't think you can really go wrong with any of these. I mean, I think that's why it's a really good situation, because really all that matters is the talent on the roster. And I think that we would all agree the talent on the roster is solid at this point. It's just about, those guys getting better. And a lot of that happens, organically. So I don't think that they can really go. I don't know. I guess the better question is there anybody on this list that you would say this would be a disaster?
Well,
I don't think so.
yeah, I mean, for basketball reasons, no. Kevin Young for me is the biggest question mark, because I feel like that's who we know least
He's the
about.
youngest. Yeah, he's 41.
Yeah, so I mean, just based off of least information, I would say Kevin Young. And then of course for non-basketball reasons, of course the Ime Udoka thing that's out there. But of course if like you don't even do it if that's an issue, right? And if it's not, then I mean that ceiling's pretty high on that. So yeah, no, I would say there is not a candidate on here. Kevin Young will come the closest. I'll say this though about Scott Brooks, and I mean this is no disrespect, but the difference though, the key difference is by the time Scott Brooks got there, I feel like we had a pretty good sense for Kevin Durant was going to be something like Kevin Durant. That Kevin Durant was a very rare and different type of figure and player on your team. And I don't feel like we can say that about any Rockets player yet, like as far as having that level of foundational piece. And that's not a knock on anybody, right? Oh, you're not Kevin Durant. Oh, well, sue me, right? Like Kevin Durant is arguably one of one and in rarefied era in like NBA history in terms of scorers and players. So there's no shame in that, but that is the difference. And then Russell Westbrook in his own right, I think ideally you're feeling like you've got players that could be on that trajectory to be that level of player, but I don't feel like that for sure yet in terms of Russell Westbrook winning an MVP and I mean, his career speaks for itself. I don't have to rattle off everything that he's done. So like, you get it. Uh, they definitely had players that early on you were able to identify and say, oh, these are different kind of guys, upper echelon type of guys. And of course, James Harden comes along there right after that, and serves as their sixth man and is playing down the stretch in key moments and all of that. So it's a little bit different from the makeup of the team. I feel like Scott Brooks, you could make a case that in some cases that he was babysitting out there and was gifted a really good situation there. Oklahoma City just being well run and drafting well. But I would agree, at least though, that it's surprising that they haven't, at least since you're doing your due diligence and there is seemingly a connection there and a logical connection there. It's a little bit surprising that they haven't reached out. I almost forgot about them until you mentioned that.
But don't forget Washington, because
Washington, yes.
Before he got there, they weren't in the playoffs. They missed the playoffs in 2016, and then in 2017 they were, basically a Kelly Olynyk explosion away from going, to the Eastern Conference Finals.
Yeah.
So I mean, the beginning of Washington, I think, should matter with Brooks, and then at the end, Wall got hurt, and then that whole thing really became they're just trying to climb out of the wall hole at that point. But I do think that first year that he had with the Wizards is something that people should at least consider when you look at his resume.
All right, man, we're running late. Let's get out of here on this, man, because you were there for Rafael Stone. Rockets general manager Rafael Stone spoke with reporters earlier in the week. This was right after dismissing or upon the announcement of Stephen Silas's dismissal. Talked for about, what was it, about 30? You guys talked to him for about 30 minutes, right? Guys talked to the general manager of the Houston Rockets for about half an hour, and he talked about a number of things, what he's looking for, what they're looking for in the head coach, defended the move, why they made this move, why they felt like they needed to make the change, all of that. But I think the biggest thing, and the reason why it's great to just get to you with this, because you were the one that asked him about the culture, because it has been criticized. He disputed that it's been a lot. But man, it feels like it's been a lot. Like maybe a lot is in the eye of the beholder, but it sure feel like a lot to me. And I don't know if you even said a lot in your question. I don't feel like you did. But either way, what did you make of? Of course, you asked the questions, don't get to pick the answers. But what did you make of Rafael Stone's defense of all of it? His explanation for the Silas firing, the direction they want to go in, and then more specifically the defense of the culture. What were some of your actually let me change that. I just thought about that. I just thought about what my actual question is. What about this culture needs to change, if anything?
I don't know. I never thought that, and I wanted to give him an opportunity to respond to some of the stuff that has been said about the organization over the last few months. You can really even take it back further to last summer when Kenyon Martin really went after what was happening here. So I wanted to give them the opportunity to respond, and I was he was strong in his language defending it. He said that this was he said that he would fight anyone who would question the culture. He said that this is like the best culture of any team that he's been around, which is probably saying probably a little bit strong, but a little bit, you think?
Slightly, a little bit of a stretch, maybe.
Well, maybe some of the culture has not been great here, though. In the past, he kind of took a shot at the Daryl Morey era Rockets, where it's like, hey, people don't like us because of past teams, which I'm pretty sure was a Daryl thing. Or
yeah, I was gonna ask you if you checked under that bus to see if Daryl was pancaked or if he was still like asking for help or what. What was Daryl's status under that bus that he threw him under?
I think he's probably still counting the money from when he left the team a couple years ago. So I think Daryl's doing okay. I think that for that they let him go. They paid him off to go, and then he was allowed to go to a new team like a month later. So I think that he the Rockets could probably afford to run him over the bus a couple of times just for that very reason. But yeah, he was obviously very full-throated with the defense of the organization. The one thing I never thought that the players on the team disliked each other. Like I do think that's important, where You want your guys to be close. You want your guys to, at least be friendly, especially when they're this young. So I do think that's one thing that matters. And I've been around teams where you could tell these guys don't like each other at all. And I never got that vibe with this Rockets team. They're always talking, they're always around each other, whether it's on the road, whether it's after games. So I do think that sort of stuff is important. But, the thing that I asked him too was, does the perception of the team just simply change when you start winning games? And I think that is probably what it is more than anything else, is that when you've lost, I think they've lost 177 games the last 3 years. When you lose 177 games in a 3-year span, people are going to start to question the culture. So if you start winning games, and all of a sudden nobody cares about any of the other stuff. But the thing, I think it stood out because of what Wall said. Wall really was the one who got this whole thing going, and like Rafael Stone did not criticize Wall. He said Wall is he's welcome to his opinion on some of this stuff. So I don't know what to make of the culture stuff, but I did want to give them the opportunity to at least address it, because this stuff has been out there now for months, and nobody with the team really has said anything other than Silas, and Silas is no longer with the team now.
Yeah, I feel like a coaching change and the right coaching change, and we just went over it. It feels like they got a really good opportunity to make the right coaching change, because it doesn't seem like they got too many bad options, if any. I feel like that could be the culture change that they need. It could simply be that. Now, there are questions about, it's been out there of Rafael Stone's involvement or meddling, whatever exact word you want to use to characterize that, in terms of like his influence on the day to day with the team and all of that. And I do wonder. We didn't talk about this, but now that we're here, I do wonder like how that plays in and factors in more or less with prospective coaches. Like, what do they want to know about that? What standards are they going to set with, ahead of time when they say, hey, look, because, you're interviewing for a job. You want the job, but at the same time, we've all interviewed for jobs. You're interviewing them too. And you're sort of setting a standard for, hey, well, if I come here, I kind of want it to be like this. So I wonder how that sort of those conversations play out and how it goes. But if that's a bigger problem than I'm letting on right now, and I'm not going to pretend to know exactly how much of a problem it is, but if it's a bigger problem than I'm letting on, I would say that's a part of the culture that would need to change and need to shift. You need to probably rethink the roles and and exactly how you use your voice within the organization, how that is going to change and adjust to the new coach, into the new situation. So, I mean, we're talking about the politics of the front office and the dynamics between the front office and the head coach, but that's going to be important. I think, I do think that's going to be important. And I don't know how much about it exactly needs to change and what about it specifically needs to change, because I'm not there. But if there's a problem there, they need to fix it. Like, they need to like do some introspection and really think about it, and not allow it to get in the way of this opportunity.
And the GM of the team has every right to be in meetings, because, at the end of the day, if the owner wants to know what's going on, he's going to ask the GM, and the GM needs to have an answer. So if Tillman Fertitta wants to know why player X is starting over player Y, then Rafael Stone needs to be able to answer that question. And if sitting in meetings is part of that, then hey, so be it. But he can't be leading the meetings. I mean, you hire a head coach, you hire a head coach, the head coach hires a staff, you have to let them do their jobs. Now, I don't know, and this will be something for Stephen Silas if we ever get to that point. Did Stephen Silas ever feel like? And I wanted to ask him this, and I never got the chance. But did you feel like? And this would be my question: did you feel like you had full autonomy to do the job when you had it? And that's one thing that I would like to know from Stephen Silas, and whoever they wind up hiring. That's going to be one of the first questions: is will you be able to do everything that you want to do as the head coach of the team?
Yeah, man. This it what man. Hey, I didn't look this up before, because a version of that question, but not that question exactly, was asked by Sarge, I think, by our guy Big Sarge asked Silas about this. And I think I typed in the wrong thing. I put in change. I meant to put in chance, but feel like he said there is a quote of something to the effect of, was it all like, like Silas is a professional. So I
Mhm.
felt like the quote was something pretty diplomatic to the effect of, hey, was it always, was it completely fair? No, but I always tried
That
to
was
make the
Cody.
best of it.
That was Cody Davis.
Was it Cody? Okay, hey, if this was in the loop, they would drop a race card on me because I knew it was one of my black friends in this here media. So my bad. Shout out to Sarge anyway, but even more of a shout out to my guy Cody Davis. That's right. Yeah, Cody Davis. Now I gotta look at that. I was looking up my wrong black friend. Cody Davis had the quote though, like, was this, do you feel like you were put in a situation to succeed? And he, to paraphrase basically more or less, in a very diplomatic and professional and kind way, said no. Like that is the end. That is not me and making large logical leaps there. That is basically what the man said. Basically, like, no, but I tried my best.
I mean,
So
it's basically
yeah,
like we're all lucky to have these jobs. Was
yeah.
essentially the answer, and I think everyone knew what we talked about this, but everyone knew what the season was going to be, and you just try and make the best out of it, and then you evaluate who you have as the head coach moving forward. And I think ultimately they felt like they needed somebody else to get them into the next stage of the rebuild, and I think that they are fine for having that opinion. I think if you talk to people within the organization, they would tell you that if you give Steven Silas a team with a top 5 player, he would absolutely thrive and get the utmost out of that team. But I think that with a younger group like, and that's the team that he had, that's the team he was supposed to coach. But if you give him a team like this, and I don't know if this is the best sort of team for him. I think that's what they would tell you within the organization.
This is the first time this has ever happened in the history of our podcast, and we're right here at the end of it. But literally, I forgot to put my laptop charger in, and the damn thing's about to die. So 1 second. All right. I hate that happened. But we're not gonna even edit it out since it did happen. I think it's kind of just great and organic. But really, man, my last thing, and I think I said all I had to say about the culture and everything. Like, it is not my intention to like rag on these guys. I just want them to get it right. Shout out to you, Rafael Stone, in this coaching search, man. Get it right. Do your thing, guys. We want you to get it right, but there's reason for skepticism. Like you're gonna do the staunch defense. I'm like, he's acting like this stuff is coming out of nowhere. Like there's no reason to kind of side eye what they've got going on, and to say that it's not a lot, man. It's not a little. We're talking about the criticism. Remember he said that. He's like, it's not a lot. It ain't a little. Like we almost we went a stretch there where every episode we had to decide whether, like, is this edition of Rockets bashing worth bringing to the show? You know what I mean? Like, I just, what did he say? Some of them. What was his first? He's like, some of them are out of their mind.
Yeah, he called some of them lazy. I mean, so I mean,
Yo,
there was a lot. Like there was a lot. I think that they
who's
were.
who's hold on, who's out of their mind, Adam? Who do you think he's talking about? Who is that? Is it the TNT guys? Like,
I think
is it
Kendrick
Kenny?
Perkins might have said something at some point. JJ Redick had something. So I don't know. I didn't follow up. I didn't follow up
Who's
on.
out of their mind, Raphael? Who is out of their mind? Who needs a psychiatric eval for their criticism of the Rockets? We need to know. This
Well,
is
we can ask them about.
this is impact journalism here that we need to conduct. Yeah, man. Before we get, do you have any play-in hot takes before we get out of here? We can wrap this thing up. Any play-in hot takes? The only thing I got really, man, because I mean I watch these games, but it hit me all of a sudden watching that um watching that Atlanta Miami game. It hit me in the face like, oh my God, the East play-in is a complete waste of time. And that's what I'm left with now. Like I am interested. Like the only game that I was really interested in was the Wednesday night game uh, with the young team with New Orleans and Oklahoma City. Those are the only teams in this play-in that I look at and I'm like, those look like either really interesting teams to watch or playoff teams. Whereas the rest of them, I'm like, okay, the Lakers have LeBron and AD. I get it. Okay, great, and they are better than they were. But like, I'm like, this is the epitome of slapping lipstick on a pig because I like basketball and I'm gonna watch basketball if you put it on TV. But this, especially the Eastern Conference side, feels like a waste of time to me. Just playing.
I mean, for the most part, they always are. Just because, how often does a 1 seed beat an 8 seed? How often does a 7 seed, or how often does an 8 seed beat a 1? How often does a 7 beat a 2? So, I mean, whoever. I guess the Lakers is kind of the one that's a little bit different, just
Yeah.
because you probably go into that series, and the Lakers, you can probably argue, have the two best players on the floor with LeBron and with Anthony Davis. I don't know if you put John Moran ahead of those guys, but obviously what they've done over the course of their career speaks for itself.
Right.
I like high leverage games. I like the games where a team might have to go home. The play-in kind of got ruined because, I don't know if ruined is the right word, but it got cheapened a little bit because, one team went into the last two games of the season with a chance to be in the play-in and they punted. So I don't think that's a great testament to the importance of the play-in ultimately. But I do like it. I like having, these. It turns out to be 6 games. Leading you into the playoffs because they're high leverage because, again, at least the Wednesday games, whoever loses goes home, and then tomorrow you have 2 elimination games. So I think that's cool. I like that. I like elimination games. So I've enjoyed it. I'm glad that they did it. And obviously it has some staying power. I don't know if there's a way to make it better. I mean, I'm pretty sure there isn't, but I've enjoyed it. I'm glad that, like I said, I enjoyed it. I'm glad that it's something that they did, and it looks like it's here to stay. So I'm all for it.
Yeah. Well, you and I obviously enjoy basketball, and that's what I've enjoyed about it. But I think you raise a good point, and maybe this just didn't resonate with me enough because I want to say I fell asleep on each of the later games. Like watch the game, and you guys know, like eventually I'm just gonna hit a wall and I'm gonna fall asleep and I'm not gonna fight it. And I fell asleep on the games, caught up in the morning and everything, and so the stakes didn't really sit with me or resonate with me as much as just like, all right, we're especially at this time of year where I mean we're pretty limited on what we've got to watch, and this is basketball. This is the time of year where you watch basketball. So I'm just locked in anyway, stakes or not, and just the time of year means that the stakes are getting higher because we're getting in, later into the basketball season. But to your point, I think you attached what works and what will always work to me about the tournament, even if you've got teams that are punting, is that there are stakes tied to the game. And you can always sell stakes. Hey, this matters. Win or go home. Like win or go. I mean, that's what works about March Madness, right? You know, um, when to play for the opportunity to win or go home. Or to go home. Like it is a good like psychological play on the sports fan because we think that the game matters more than it really does because at the end of the day, I mean, you're really just watching Miami and Atlanta, two teams that don't have a chance to do nothing, but it feels important. You're watching the Lakers who you think because they got LeBron and AD, if they win and they get in, they can make a run at it. But man, you watch those games and you're like, man, I don't think they're good enough, and I don't think that they're. I don't think that they are a lot better than they were, but I don't think that they're quite good enough to really do anything in these playoffs. But stakes are high, and it's been fun watching. We will talk more Rockets, obviously, on the next episodes. Of course, we've got in about a month we got the draft lottery, and I don't know if you guys heard, but the Rockets got some stakes in that. Okay, the Rockets got some stakes in that, so we'll be breaking some things down between now and then. Of course, the draft later on in June. So plenty of stuff to break down. Coaching interviews, figure out who's the next head coach going to be, and what the future of this Rockets organization is going to look like, man. So make sure you are subscribing to the H Town Hoops podcast. Rate it, review it, Tell people about it, word of mouth, anything that you can do. We appreciate it. And for Adam Spolane, Austin Mendez producing this thing for us, I'm Brandon Scott. Till next time, y'all be good.